Hello and welcome to your last textbook section on China. We're going to talk today about two key issues in Chinese foreign/domestic policy, depending how you define it, those being Taiwan and Hong Kong. Starting with Taiwan. The legacy of the dispute between China and Taiwan dates back to the Chinese Civil War. From 1895 to 1945, Taiwan is colonized by Japan. The Republic of China, which is the recognized government under Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalists, take over the government of Taiwan after the end of World War II in 1945. And when the communists boot the Kuomintang, the nationalists, out of the mainland China by winning the Civil War in 1949, Chiang Kai-shek and a lot of remaining people loyal to the nationalists flee to Taiwan. They declare that their capital, and they declare that that's the capital of the Republic of China, the state which they've been running for the last couple of decades. And they kind of establish this posture that although Mao Zedong has declared the establishment of a new state, the People's Republic of China, with its capital in Beijing, the nationalists say, well, we are just sort of temporarily relocated to Taiwan. We are going to temporarily put our capital in Taipei, but we are the seat of the legitimate government of the entire Chinese mainland, as well as Taiwan, and someday we're going to take it back. And they actually go on for the next couple of decades, basically speaking about themselves as if someday China, the mainland, and Taiwan will be reunified under the government of the nationalists. For the next couple of decades, most Western countries and most international organizations kind of go along with that posture, recognizing Taiwan as China's legitimate government. But things will start to change in the early 1970s when it increasingly becomes evident that reunification is not imminent, that the People's Republic of China is there to stay, and that Taiwan may actually not be as important a player in global politics and economics as it is setting itself out to be. In 1971, the United Nations shifts its recognition of the Chinese government. They sort of unrecognize the Kuomintang government, and they recognize the People's Republic of China. And so all of a sudden, it's the communists and not the nationalists that are casting China's vote at the United Nations, including exercising its veto power on the Security Council. The United States will follow suit pretty soon thereafter under Richard Nixon's government. And so tensions persist for the next couple of decades. And in 1992, Beijing and Taipei, so the PRC government and the Republic of China government, reached this kind of uneasy, kind of vague consensus called just the 1992 Consensus, in which they essentially say in so many words, we're going to agree to disagree. Both sides continue to maintain that there is just one China. They just don't establish any real specificity about which China it is or which government legitimately deserves power. And it's important to note that within Taiwan, within the Republic of China, there is some significant political disagreement about whether the 1992 Consensus is the right approach or whether Taiwan should just decide that it is an independent state. Taiwan, under the Kuomintang, under the first couple of decades after the Chinese Civil War, was operated kind of under military rule on the theory that the Republic of China's constitution should still govern all of China, and it wouldn't be fair to let just Taiwanese voters elect the leadership of all of China, so we should wait until reunification to restore the democratic constitution. But over the course of the 1970s and 1980s, the Kuomintang kind of gradually relaxes its authoritarian controls, culminating in the 1996 first ever democratic elections for president. Taiwan today has a pretty thriving democratic system of government with a mixed electoral system, with quotas for women on the proportional representation side of the legislative elections, with seats reserved for Taiwan's indigenous peoples. And most importantly, with a strong tradition of having physical fights in the legislature, many of which you can find on YouTube. Highly recommended for your weekend viewing. The situation between Taiwan and China for the last 30 years or so has been a really complicated one of political tensions, political hostilities, sometimes, serious security risks across the Taiwan Strait, but also increasing economic investment. And as China started opening up its economy in the 1980s, it was actually Taiwanese people who constituted a really significant share of the early foreign investors in China because they wanted to take advantage of China's geographic proximity and its cheaper labor markets. So trade between the People's Republic of China and Taiwan has increased in recent years. They're really, really important trading partners for each other. But at the same time, politically, the countries are growing increasingly separate, and the relationship in some cases remains tense, especially when you start talking about issues of sovereignty or independence or international recognition. Um, Over the last few decades, more and more people in Taiwan have started identifying themselves specifically as Taiwanese, so that now a majority of people in Taiwan say that their national identity is Taiwanese, not Chinese, and not a mix of both. But at the same time, that doesn't necessarily mean that most people in Taiwan favored declaring independence and trying to get international recognition as a sovereign state. Um, and a lot of that has to do with China's stated policy, which is that the PRC has repeatedly said it is going to use military force if it looks as if Taiwan is about to declare independence. And so what we now have is a strange situation in which Taiwan, in basically every measurable respect, is de facto an independent country. It has its own elections. It has its own economic system. It has its own political parties. It has its own national identity. But Taiwan and China both kind of maintain the fiction that, well, if we don't talk about whether Taiwan's a sovereign state, that's probably the best for everybody. Um, you can see this in the diplomatic representation that Taiwan's been able to gain around the world, which, as you can see from this map, is a pretty short list. And I think actually, since this map was made, Kiribati and the Solomon Islands have both been removed from the list of countries that recognize Taiwan. The PRC has for a long time maintained what's known as the One China policy, meaning that the People's Republic of China refuses to have diplomatic relations with any country that has diplomatic relations with Taiwan. In other words, if you talk to my enemy, if you sit with them at lunch, I'll never sit with you at lunch again. And so there's a very, very short list of countries that actually have formal diplomatic relations with Taiwan, that have a Taiwanese ambassador in their capital. And China, in the last few years, has done a great deal of calculated, diplomacy and foreign investment to try and get that list shorter. And so occasionally you'll see a Pacific Island country or a Latin American or Caribbean country that used to have diplomatic relations with Taiwan that suddenly switches its recognition to the People's Republic of China and coincidentally announces that they've accepted a major investment or a major loan from China or from a Chinese state-owned enterprise. Um, to my mind, because you know that I love the Olympics more than almost anything else in the world, the best manifestation of this, the best illustration of this, is that every Olympics at the Parade of Nations, athletes who identify themselves as Taiwanese, who for the most part were born and raised in Taiwan, referring to themselves as citizens of Taiwan, have to march out at the Parade of Nations under this weird flag and carrying the label on their uniforms, on their track jackets of Chinese Taipei. Because the People's Republic of China wouldn't allow Taiwan to be recognized as a member of the IOC, the International Olympic Committee, under the name Taiwan, because the name Taiwan or the name Republic of China would imply that Taiwan was either the legitimate government of China or a sovereign state. Let's shift now to an area where sovereignty is a lot less hotly contested, but where autonomy remains a really, really big flashpoint, and that's Hong Kong. Here it is in the southeast of China. Hong Kong's special status within China dates back to the 1840s, when the British fought a war with China literally about the right to sell drugs in China, evocatively, it's named the First Opium War. And in the treaty, after losing that war, China had to hand over to the British the peninsula and island of Hong Kong, basically for the British to use as a warehouse for their goods and as a place where their traders could operate freely. And so the British proceed to operate Hong Kong as a colony for the next 150 years. By 1997, empire, as you may know from your studies of world history, has kind of fallen out of fashion. And so the British, to much fanfare, sign a treaty with China, with the People's Republic of China, in which they agree to hand Hong Kong back to Chinese sovereignty. And in exchange, the British kind of negotiate with China a special status for Hong Kong. They get the Chinese to promise that Hong Kong will be able to retain a pretty significant degree of autonomy for the next 50 years. And so Hong Kong, along with Macau nearby, which is a former Portuguese colony handed back in 1999, Hong Kong now exists in the PRC as what's known as a special administrative region. What that means is that Hong Kong, both historically and in the present, is distinct from the People's Republic of China, from mainland China in a few ways. It has this long legacy of a different administrative structure, and that certainly wasn't democratic, given the nature of British imperialism. But it does have a different set of bureaucratic institutions. It now operates a really complex electoral system that's not a direct democracy by any means, but that does allow for more participation in the PRC's system. Hong Kong has different, trade relationships with the rest of the world. It's home to offices or headquarters of lots of multinational corporations. It's got a thriving financial sector. It's got a different currency. Most Hong Kongers speak Cantonese as opposed to Mandarin, which is the predominant language on the mainland. And so Hong Kong is really distinctive, both culturally and economically, as well as legally and politically. The governing principle under which China offered Hong Kong membership in the PRC, under which China tried to convince both the Hong Kongers and the British that they would be treated fairly once returning to Chinese sovereignty, is a principle known as one country, two systems. In other words, we're all part of the People's Republic of China, but the rules are going to be somewhat different in Hong Kong. China, as is common in any kind of federal system, the People's Republic of China, the national government, continues to control defense policy for Hong Kong, continues to control foreign relations for Hong Kong. So Hong Kong certainly can't have its own military, it certainly can't have its own embassies in foreign capitals. But on the other hand, under the one country, two systems principle, Hong Kong gets to run its own executive, its own legislature, and significantly its own judiciary. You might remember from last week that China in general is a country which has a lot more rule by law than rule of law. There isn't even on paper a principle of judicial independence from the legislature in China. And so for Hong Kong, it's important to say we have a stronger rule of law, we have a more independent judiciary. That matters for civil liberties for individual people, and it also matters when you're trying to attract foreign businesses to relocate their offices and to send their employees to Hong Kong's territory. However, a really important thing to remember is that if what you're thinking is, gee, this sounds a lot like asymmetric federalism in Russia, unlike in Russia, the system between China and Hong Kong remains a unitary system. China has promised to give Hong Kong a significant degree of autonomy until 2047, but there are no constitutionally protected rights that Hong Kong has to maintain its own political system. And as a consequence, anytime Hong Kongers assert a more independent identity or demand more autonomy, and anytime the People's Republic of China tries to crack down on what Hong Kongers perceive to be their special rights under the one country, two systems principle, tensions tend to flare up. And you should be watching a video at some point over the weekend that demonstrates the most recent evidence of that in the protests in Hong Kong over an extradition bill starting in 2019. That's all. I'll see you on Monday.